The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and neither had Margaret Chen's tears. She sat in the corner booth of the diner where she'd worked for 22 years, staring at the eviction notice that seemed to blur and sharpen with each blink. 63 years old, arthritic hands that could barely grip a coffee pot anymore, and exactly 17 days until she'd be on the street. The word her kept echoing in her mind, a pronoun that felt increasingly hollow, increasingly invisible. When had she become just her? The old waitress, the burden, the forgotten one. Across the diner, Maya Rodriguez wiped down tables with the kind of vigor that only a 24-year-old with dreams still intact could muster. She'd been working alongside Margaret for 6 months, saving every penny for nursing school, her mother's medical bills swallowing most of her paycheck before she could even taste financial freedom. Maya had noticed Margaret's swollen eyes, the way her hands shook more than usual, how she'd retreated to that booth. During her break, instead of chatting with the regulars like she normally did, "Miss Margaret?" Maya's voice was soft as she approached, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You okay?" Margaret looked up, and something in her weathered face crumbled. She'd spent decades serving others, asking customers if they were okay, and now this young woman, this struggling, exhausted young woman was asking her. The kindness felt like a match struck in a dark room. "I'm being evicted," Margaret whispered, the words tasting like ash. "My building's been sold. They're renovating, and I can't afford the new rent. I don't have family, Maya. I don't have anywhere to go." Maya slid into the booth, her own problems momentarily forgotten. She'd been raised by a grandmother who'd taught her that the measure of a person wasn't in what they accumulated, but in what they gave when they had little to give. "How much do you need?" $3,200 for first and last month's rent, plus deposit, at the only place. I can find that somewhat affordable." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Might as well be $32 million. Maya's mind raced. She had maybe $800 saved after this month's bills. Her mother needed medication. School tuition was due. But looking at Margaret, this woman who'd trained her, who'd covered her shifts when her mom was hospitalized, who'd slipped her extra tips when the diner was slow, Maya felt something shift inside her chest. "We'll figure it out," Maya said with a certainty she didn't feel. That evening, Maya did something she'd never done before. She posted Margaret's story on social media, her hands trembling as she typed. She'd always been private, preferring to handle struggles quietly, but desperation had a way of making you brave. She shared a photo of Margaret smiling behind the diner counter, her weathered hands holding a coffee pot, and wrote about 22 years of service, of kindness, of a woman who'd fed a community and now needed the community to feed her back. She didn't expect what happened next. By morning, the post had been shared 300 times. By noon, a local news station had called. By evening, Margaret's story was being discussed on the radio, and the diner's phone wouldn't stop ringing. But it wasn't just attention that poured in, it was money. $10 here, 20 there, sometimes 50, from people who'd been served by Margaret over the years. The mailman who she'd always greeted by name donated. The teacher whose kids she'd snuck free pie to. The businessman whose marriage proposal she'd witnessed years ago. Tom Bradley, the diner's owner, a gruff man in his 50s who'd inherited the place from his father, watched the outpouring with something breaking open inside him. He'd been so focused on profit margins and efficiency that he'd forgotten the diner was more than a business. It was a community living room. Margaret had been serving his customers with grace for longer than he'd been alive, and he'd never once asked her how she was really doing. He pulled Maya aside on the 3rd day of the fundraising effort. "How much has been raised?" $2,200, Maya said, her eyes bright with hope and exhaustion. "We're getting close." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "Tell people to stop donating to Margaret's rent." Maya's face fell. "Mr. Bradley, please don't—" "Tell them," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "that her rent is covered. I own a small apartment above the diner. It's been empty for years. It's hers, rent-free, for as long as she needs it. Tell them to donate that money to her retirement fund instead. God knows she's earned it." Maya's eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around the startled man, who awkwardly patted her back, unused to displays of affection, but he didn't pull away. When they told Margaret, she simply sat down at the counter and cried. Not the hollow, desperate tears of before, but something cleaner, something that felt like release. Tom stood there, uncomfortable and moved, realizing he'd just made the best business decision of his life by making a human one. But the story didn't end there. The news coverage had reached further than anyone anticipated. 3 days later, a woman in her 40s walked into the diner, her designer coat and nervous energy marking her as different from the usual crowd. She asked for Margaret by name. "I'm Catherine," she said, her voice shaking. Catherine Williams now, but it was Catherine Morrison 38 years ago. "You probably don't remember me." Margaret studied her face, searching through decades of memories. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Katie? Little Katie Morrison?" Catherine nodded, tears already streaming. "You used to sneak me free meals when I was a kid. My mom was sick, my dad had left, and I'd come in here with whatever change I could find. You always told me the food was from yesterday and would just go to waste. You did that for months, maybe longer. I thought you forgot, but I never did." Margaret reached across the counter, gripping Catherine's hands. "Of course I remember you. You were so small, so scared. How is your mother?" "She passed 10 years ago," Catherine said softly. "But she lived 20 more years than doctors expected. She got treatment, got better, because of people like you. I went to college, became a lawyer, built a life. And I've spent years trying to find the woman from the diner who fed a hungry little girl and asked for nothing in return. When I saw your story on the news, I recognized you immediately." Catherine opened her purse and pulled out an envelope. "The money that's been raised for you, it's beautiful. But it's not enough for the retirement you deserve. This is from me, from that little girl you fed. It's enough to ensure you never have to worry about rent or food or anything again." Margaret opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a check that made her gasp. $50,000. "I can't accept this," Margaret whispered. "You already did," Catherine said firmly. 38 years ago, when you accepted a scared little girl and showed her that the world had kindness in it. You taught me what mattered. Let me give that back to you." Maya, who'd been watching from across the diner, felt something profound settle into her bones. This was what humanity looked like. Not grand gestures from billionaires, but ordinary people lifting each other up, creating ripples that touched shores decades later. That evening, the diner was packed with people who'd heard the story. Some who knew Margaret, many who didn't. Tom had declared that all the food that night would be served at cost, which was his way of saying free without saying it. The community had come together not because they expected anything in return, but because witnessing kindness being repaid made them believe in something larger than themselves. Margaret stood at the center of the diner, surrounded by a makeshift family she'd served for over 2 decades, and realized that that pronoun that had felt so empty, was actually full. She was the her who'd made a difference, the her who'd been remembered, the her whose small acts of kindness had echoed through time and come back as a symphony. Maya stood beside her mentor, her arm around the older woman's shoulders, understanding now that the money she'd saved for nursing, school would still be there, that her path wasn't derailed by helping someone else. If anything, it was clearer. This was why she wanted to be a nurse, to be the person who saw the suffering and said, "I'm here." Tom watched his diner filled with life and laughter, realizing he'd been running a business when he could have been building a legacy. His father would have approved of the man he'd become that week. And Catherine, sitting in a booth watching the woman who'd saved her all those years ago, felt a circle close. She'd spent her career fighting for justice in courtrooms, but the most important justice she'd ever delivered was sitting right here, in a modest check that said, "Your kindness mattered. You matter. You are seen." The rain had stopped, and through the diner windows, a sunset broke through the clouds, painting everything gold. Margaret looked around at the faces, some lined with age, some young and hopeful, all connected by the invisible, threads of human compassion, and understood that she'd never been invisible at all. She'd been the light in the corner, steady and warm, and now that light was reflected back to her 1,000-fold. Not because she'd asked for it, but because she'd given it freely when it mattered most. That night, as the diner finally emptied and Maya helped, Margaret cleaned up one last time as co-workers. The younger woman asked, "How does it feel?" Margaret paused, a dish towel in her weathered hands, and smiled, really smiled, the kind that reached her eyes and years. It feels like coming home, to a home I didn't know I'd been building all along. Her, in the end, wasn't just a pronoun. It was a testament, a story written in small acts of courage and kindness, in showing up day after day, in choosing to see people instead of passing them by. Margaret Chen had spent her life being her, the one who cared, the one who noticed, the one who gave. And in her hour of need, the world had returned the favor, proving that no act of goodness, no matter how small, is ever truly lost. It ripples outward, touching lives in ways we cannot predict, building a world where her and him and them all mean the same thing. Someone worth saving, someone worth seeing, someone worth loving back.